You still belong to me." He said it in Italian, slow and quiet, smiling, because he believed no one in that restaurant understood a single word. I was right about everyone else. He was catastrophically wrong about the man sitting alone in the corner booth. If you've ever watched someone use a language like a weapon, counting on silence to protect them, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Sophia Bennett had learned through years of hard and quiet experience that the most dangerous men were never the ones who screamed. Screaming was a performance. Screaming was theater. Screaming meant a man wanted an audience, wanted witnesses, wanted someone to see how powerful he could make himself look. The truly dangerous ones were different. The truly dangerous ones got very, very calm. They dropped their voices to a register just above a whisper, and they leaned in close enough that only you could hear them, and they said the most frightening things imaginable, with a smile still sitting perfectly on their face. Luca Moretti had always been that kind of man. Sophia had known it from the beginning. If she was honest with herself, and she was still learning how to be honest with herself about those years. She had known it from the second month of their relationship, when he'd criticized her laugh at a party full of strangers, told her quietly on the drive home that it was embarrassing that she was embarrassing that he was only telling her because he loved her and nobody else would bother. She'd apologized. She'd actually apologized. For laughing. That was the version of herself she had worked every day for 11 months to leave behind. She was doing well. That was the truth she held on to when the nights felt long and the bakery savings felt impossibly small, and her two-bedroom apartment above the dry cleaning shop felt less like independence and more like just a different kind of lonely. She was doing well. She had her job at Bella Vita. She had her notebook full of recipes. She had a realistic plan and a small savings account, and a life that belonged entirely, completely, undeniably to her. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Until a Tuesday evening in late October, when the rain came down hard against the windows of Bella Vita, and the dinner crowd was thick and loud, and Sophia was moving through her section with 3 plates balanced against her arm, and she looked up toward the entrance because the hostess had stopped talking mid-sentence, and there he was. Luca. He looked exactly the same, which was somehow the worst part. Some part of her had hoped maybe in the way you hope for things you know are irrational, that the time would have changed him, made him less polished, given him some visible sign of whatever he actually was underneath the expensive clothes and the easy confidence. But he looked exactly the same. Dark jacket, hair perfect. That particular way he had of standing in a doorway like he was giving the room a moment to appreciate him before he decided to grace it with his presence. His eyes found her in 3 seconds. They always did. He had that instinct, the predator's instinct for locating the specific person in a crowd who most wanted not to be found. She watched his face move through its sequence. Surprise. Amusement. And then, colder, quieter, settling in behind his eyes like something that had been waiting a long time, satisfaction. He walked toward her. She did not run. She wanted to run. Her body understood the situation before her mind finished processing it, and every nerve in her legs fired simultaneously with a single clear message: move, leave go now. But her hands were still holding 3 plates, and the table in her section was still waiting, and her feet stayed planted on the floor, because Sophia Bennett had spent 11 months rebuilding a version of herself that did not run, that did not flinch, that did not give Luca Moretti the satisfaction of watching her shrink. She set the plates down. She thanked the table. She turned around. He was already 6 feet away. Sophia. He said her name the way he always had, soft, proprietary, like it was something he owned, and was graciously allowing her to borrow. You look good. Luca. She kept her voice completely flat. I'm working. I can see that. His eyes moved around the restaurant with that slow, appraising quality that meant he was calculating who was watching, who mattered, what he could get away with. I've been trying to reach you. I know. You haven't answered. I know that too. He smiled. The kind of smile that had once made her feel chosen and now made her stomach go cold. We should talk. There's nothing to talk about. Sophia. Still soft, still calm, still smiling. We both know that's not true. She had 3 other tables in her section. She had a shift that ran until 11. She had a manager named Carla, who didn't need drama in the dining room on a busy Tuesday, and who wouldn't hesitate to pull Sophia aside if a situation developed. She had approximately 47 reasons why she needed this conversation to end in the next 30 seconds. "I have to get back to work," she said. "Please leave. Please." He repeated the word with a faint, almost theatrical appreciation, like she'd said something charming. "You always did have nice manners." He was not leaving. I was not going to leave voluntarily. She understood that now, with perfect clarity. Whatever he'd come here for, he wasn't going to walk away without it. And Sophia had enough history with Luca Moretti to know that what he'd come for wasn't conversation. Conversation wasn't the point. The point was the demonstration. The point was standing in the space she'd built for herself and reminding himself that he could enter any room she was in and make it his. "Excuse me," she said, and she tried to move past him. His hand caught her wrist. Not violently. That was the deliberate genius of it. He caught her wrist the way you might catch someone who was about to drop something gently, almost helpfully, with his fingers curved around her pulse point, like he was simply steadying her. Anyone watching from more than 5 feet away would have seen nothing alarming. A man and a woman having a conversation, his hand on her wrist completely ordinary. But Sophia felt every individual finger. She felt exactly how much pressure was behind them. And she felt the particular quality of stillness that came into Luca's body when he had what he wanted, that settling, that satisfaction. And she knew that standing exactly still and waiting for her to make a decision was the entire point. She met his eyes. He smiled. And then he switched to Italian. She had learned over the course of their relationship that Luca's Italian was something he used the way some men used money, selectively, strategically, as a demonstration of access to something others didn't have. His family was from Napoli. He'd grown up bilingual, and he treated it like a private club, something to be deployed when he wanted to exclude. At parties when he wanted to say something cutting about the people around him. On the phone with his brother, when he wanted Sophia to feel that conversations were happening she couldn't follow. And in moments like this, moments of threat, moments of control, when he wanted to wrap his cruelty in a language that protected him from consequences, because no one around them would understand. That was the calculation. Chicago restaurant, American staff, American customers. He could say anything he wanted in Italian, and it would land only on Sophia, the one person whose understanding he needed and whose silence he was counting on. "You should have answered my calls," he said. The Italian was fluid, unhurried. His grip on her wrist stayed exactly the same. "That was rude, Sophia. You know I don't like being ignored." She pulled against his hand. He let her feel that it wasn't going to work. "You left," he said, still in Italian, still in that register, just above a whisper. His face still arranged in the pleasant conversational expression of a man catching up with an old friend. "You just left, after everything, after what we were to each other. You packed a bag and you disappeared, and you didn't say anything, and you've been pretending for a year, like none of it happened, like I don't exist. Luca, I'm talking, gentle, absolute. You left without permission. That's not something I accept, Sophia. You know that. You've always known that." He tilted his head slightly, studying her face with that clinical quality. She remembered the way he examined her distress, the way a man might examine a crack in something he owned. "Did you think I wouldn't find you? Did you think this?" His eyes moved around the restaurant again, briefly, dismissively. Was far enough. Sophia's hands had gone cold. Her wrist, where his fingers circled her pulse, felt like it belonged to someone else. She was surrounded by people. She was in a crowded restaurant on a Tuesday night with ambient conversation and clinking glasses, and the distant sound of someone's birthday being sung in the back section, and she had never in her life felt more completely isolated. "You still belong to me." He said it in Italian, flat, factual, unapologetic, like a man stating a property right. "That's not a feeling, that's just a fact. You can run as far as you want. You can change your number. You can get a job in a restaurant that smells like garlic and pretend you have a different life. But you know the truth. I know the truth. And eventually, Sophia, you're going to stop wasting both of our time." A glass was set down on a table. The sound was quiet, ordinary. The kind of sound that happened 50 times a minute in a restaurant this size. But something about it, the deliberateness of it maybe, or the timing pulled Sophia's attention across the room. To a corner table near the window. A man sitting alone. He had been there for a while. She had served him his first glass of wine approximately 40 minutes ago, and she'd clocked him the way she clocked all her solo diners. Middle-aged, maybe late 30s or early 40s, impeccably dressed in a dark suit with no tie. The kind of stillness about him that came from genuine comfort with being alone, rather than the restless phone-checking discomfort of most single diners. He'd ordered in a quiet voice. He'd said thank you. He'd opened no laptop, checked no phone. Simply sat with his wine and his own thoughts, which she'd found slightly unusual, and then immediately filed away and forgotten about because she had tables to manage. She looked at him now, and found that he was already looking back. Not at her exactly. His eyes were on Luca. And the expression on his face was not anger, not alarm, not the politely averted gaze of a stranger, carefully not getting involved. It was something quieter than any of those things, and somehow far more unsettling. He had the look of a man who had heard every word, and who understood all of them. Sophia didn't know his name yet. She didn't know anything about him yet. But something in the quality of his attention, the absolute still complete attention of a man who had decided something, made the air in her chest change. Luca still holding her wrist, still speaking in Italian, still wrapped in the complete confidence of a man. Certain he was operating in a private language, had not noticed the man in the corner. That was his first mistake. Later, Sophia would try to explain to her sister what happened in the next 60 seconds, and she would fail because the mechanics of it were simple, and the experience of it was anything but. What happened was the man in the corner stood up. He stood up in the way that certain people stand up, not with urgency, not with the energy of someone reacting, but with the settled inevitability of someone who had already decided what was going to happen, and was simply allowing time to catch up with his decision. He crossed the restaurant. He wasn't tall exactly, or he was tall, but it wasn't the first thing you noticed. The first thing you noticed was the quality of stillness he carried with him, even while moving, the way the room seemed to shift around him rather than him moving through it. He reached them. He stopped. He looked at Luca, and he spoke. In Italian. Perfect, unhurried, absolute Italian, delivered in the same quiet register Luca had been using with the same conversational ease, except that the content of it was something Luca had not prepared for in any version of this evening he had imagined. Let go of her wrist. 4 words, barely above a murmur, completely without threat in their tone, the way a statement of fundamental physics is without threat. It simply describes reality as it is. Luca's hand went still. Sophia felt it happen, that specific quality of freeze that moves through a body when the central premise of a situation collapses. His fingers were still around her wrist, but they had stopped being a grip and become simply a position. 5 fingers located against her skin, with no force behind them, no purpose anymore behind them. He looked at the man, and Sophia watched the sequence move through Luca's face. Confusion, first genuine and unguarded, the way a card player looks when someone names the card in his hand. Then the recalculation. Then she had seen this so rarely with Luca that it took her a moment to identify it, something she could only call uncertainty. "You speak Italian," Luca said. Not a question. A piece of new information he was trying to integrate into a model of the world that hadn't included it 30 seconds ago. The man said, "Enough." 1 word. Delivered the way a closing argument is delivered, not with heat, but with absolute certainty that the matter is concluded. "This is a private conversation," Luca said, and the Italian had taken on a quality Sophia had heard before, the studied calm of a man who is frightened and will not admit it. "Between old friends. Friends don't hold each other's wrists." The man's eyes didn't move. They were on Luca's face with the complete, unblinking quality of a man who is not trying to intimidate, but who has simply never developed the social habit of looking away from things that are uncomfortable. "Let go of her," And who exactly are? Let go of her wrist, the man said. Still in Italian, still at that same volume. The same 3 words rearranged slightly, as though Luca hadn't understood them the first time, and he was willing to try a different order. And then sit back down at your table and finish your dinner or leave. Either is acceptable, but this conversation is finished. The seconds that followed were some of the longest in Sophia's memory. She was aware of the restaurant, continuing around them, the ambient noise unchanged, the other tables oblivious. Nobody having noticed anything because nothing loud had happened and nothing visible. She was aware of Luca's jaw tightening. She was aware of the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid, almost visible assessment of a man deciding whether the ground beneath him could still hold. And then Luca's fingers opened. Her wrist was free. Luca looked at the man for another moment with an expression that was trying to be contempt and landing several floors below it. Then he looked at Sophia. "We'll talk later," he said in English now, which registered somewhere in her mind as significant, but she was too shaken to examine it immediately. "No," she said. "We won't." Luca straightened his jacket. He looked once more at the man in the dark suit who had not moved, whose expression had not changed, who was simply standing there with the specific patience of someone who has agreed to wait for a process to complete. And then Luca turned and walked toward the exit. Sophia stood completely still until she heard the front door of the restaurant open and close. Then she let out a breath that felt like it had been building since October, or maybe since longer than that. She turned to look at the man. He was already stepping back, already turning toward his table, with the air of someone who has finished a small, unremarkable task, and is returning to his evening. He reached his table. He sat down. He picked up his wine glass. He did not look at her with any expectation. He did not look at her with the particular energy of a man who has done something heroic and would like to be recognized for it. He simply sat down and resumed being a man alone at a corner table drinking wine. Sophia stood for a moment longer, her heart still in her throat, her wrist still faintly warm from where Luca's grip had been. Around her, the restaurant moved on in complete ignorance of what had just happened. A table nearby was laughing at something. The kitchen sent out a tray of food. She walked to the corner table. He looked up when she stopped beside him. His eyes were dark and calm. "You understood him," she said. "Yes." Everything he said. A pause. Yes. She didn't know what she had expected him to say to that. She had not thought further than the fact of it, the enormous, disorienting fact of it that she had spent 3 years of her life believing that language was the thing that protected Luca from accountability, the private channel through which he delivered his threats, and this stranger had sat in a corner booth and heard every word and understood every word, and then stood up and ended it in approximately 60 seconds. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and something moved across his face, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like recognition. "You're still shaking," he said. She looked down at her hands. He was right. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said. "That's obvious. I just thought you should know you're shaking." He said it with a complete absence of condescension, a purely observational quality, the way you'd tell someone their coat was falling off their shoulder. Something about that. The simple, uncomplicated directness of it made her eyes sting unexpectedly because she had spent so long in a relationship with a man who commented on her physical reality as a form of power. And this was so entirely different from that. "I'm Sophia," she said. "I know," he said again. He said your name several times. "Right." She managed something that was almost a laugh. He did. "Matteo," he said. He didn't offer a last name. He picked up his wine glass, and then as though something had occurred to him, he set it back down. "The man who just left, is he likely to come back tonight?" Sophia thought about it honestly. Probably not tonight. But later. She thought about that too. He's not someone who lets things go. Matteo nodded very slightly, the way you nod when information confirms something you already suspected. "All right," he said. He looked at her with that same quality of complete, uncomplicated directness. "You should get back to your tables." It was such a simple, practical observation, delivered with such complete absence of drama, that Sophia found herself almost laughing again. Or maybe it was the opposite of laughing. Maybe it was relief. The specific relief of someone who has been drowning in intensity and been thrown something ordinary to hold on to. "Yeah," she said. "I should. She went back to her tables. She took orders. She smiled at the right moments and refilled water glasses and delivered a birthday dessert to the table in the back. She did her job. And every few minutes, without intending to, her eyes moved to the corner table where a man in a dark suit sat alone with his wine, and either he was watching her or he happened to be looking in the direction of her section. When she looked over, and she could not tell which it was, and something about not being able to tell was the most complicated feeling she'd had all night. At 9:47, Matteo Romano paid his check. He left a tip that made Sophia stop and look at the number twice. He walked toward the exit with that same particular quality of movement. Not hurried, not dramatic, simply purposeful in the way of someone who always knows exactly where they're going. He paused at the door. He looked back at her across the restaurant, across all the noise and the clinking glasses and the oblivious Tuesday evening crowd, with an expression that she filed away and thought about for the rest of her shift and the walk home and the long quiet hour before she fell asleep. Not a threat. Not a promise. Not even exactly a question. Something more like acknowledgement. The recognition of one person by another person across a crowded room in a language that needed no translation. Then he pushed open the door and walked out into the rain. Sophia cleared his table. She found beneath the edge of the wine glass a business card. No name, no title, just a phone number, and beneath it written in handwriting that was clean and unhurried and took up exactly the space it needed if he comes back. She put the card in her apron pocket. She went back to work. And somewhere across the city, Luca Moretti was sitting in his car outside the restaurant, watching the rain come down against the windshield, running the name Matteo Romano through every contact he had, and beginning for the first time in a very long time to understand what it felt like to be afraid. The business card stayed in her apron pocket for 3 days. Sophia didn't take it out. She didn't look at it again. She knew the number was there, could feel it almost the way you feel a splinter you haven't dealt with yet, but she didn't take it out because taking it out meant making a decision about it, and she wasn't ready to make any decisions about Matteo Romano. She wasn't even ready to think about him too carefully, because thinking about him led immediately to thinking about Tuesday night, and thinking about Tuesday night led to the feeling she kept running away from, that particular cold clarity of standing in a crowded restaurant while Luca's fingers wrapped around her wrist, and nobody noticed, nobody saw, and the only person in that entire room who understood what was happening was a stranger in a corner booth who had no reason whatsoever to stand up, but he had stood up. She went to work on Wednesday. She went to work on Thursday. She covered someone's lunch shift on Friday and wiped down tables and took orders and smiled at the right moments and told herself methodically and firmly that Tuesday had been a crisis and the crisis was over, and she did not owe Matteo Romano a phone call or gratitude beyond what she'd already expressed or anything else. She was fine. She had handled it. She was moving on. Then, on Friday evening, just before the dinner rush, her coworker Daniela grabbed her elbow near the service station and said in a voice pitched low enough that only Sophia could hear, "Hey, that guy is back." Sophia's stomach dropped. She turned her head toward the entrance and felt a wave of cold move through her chest, and then it receded because it wasn't Luca standing near the hostess stand. It was Matteo. In another dark suit, no tie, the same quality of stillness she remembered. He was talking to the hostess who was already moving to seat him, and he wasn't looking toward Sophia's section yet. "You know him," Daniela said. "He was in Tuesday," Sophia said. "The good tipper." "Yeah." Daniela looked at him with frank appreciation. "He asked to be seated in your section." Sophia's hands went still against the counter. "He asked specifically," she said. "Specifically," Daniela confirmed with the particular tone of a woman conveying information she suspects is significant and is enjoying the delivery of it. "Corner table, your section." His words were, I'm quoting, "if that's not inconvenient for her." Daniela paused to let that land. Who says that, Sophia? Who asks if it's inconvenient? That's a grown man. Sophia picked up her order pad. She told herself she wasn't nervous. She went to the corner table. He looked up when she arrived. His expression was the same as she remembered, direct, calm, uncomplicated. "You came back," she said. She hadn't intended to open with that. She'd intended to open with something professional, something about the specials. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. "I'm fine." "I can see that." A pause. "He hasn't come back." "Not yet." Mateo held her gaze for a moment. "Not yet," he repeated quietly. "He's not someone who gives up," she said. She didn't know why she was telling him this. She hadn't even said it this plainly to her sister, who had asked twice and received twice the answer that everything was handled. "He'll decide on his own timeline what to do next. That's how he works. He doesn't react, he plans. He makes you wait. And then when you've almost convinced yourself it's over, he shows up again." Something shifted in Mateo's expression. Not surprise, it looked more like confirmation, like a man hearing the name of something he already knew the shape of. "How long were you with him?" he asked. She hadn't expected the question. She answered it anyway. 3 years. The silence that followed was the specific weighted kind that comes not from discomfort, but from a man actually thinking about what you've said, rather than preparing his response to it. "I'll have the Bronzino," he said finally. "And whatever you'd recommend with it." She recommended the Barolo. He agreed without looking at the wine list. She wrote it down and then walked back to the service station, and she stood there for a moment, with her back to the dining room, and her hand pressed flat against the counter, and told herself to breathe normally, because she was a grown woman, and she was fine. And Matteo Romano being in her section was not a development she needed to assign meaning to. He was a customer. A customer who came back twice in 1 week and asked to be seated specifically in her section and wanted to make sure she was all right, but a customer. She was still working on that logic when Daniela appeared beside her and said without preamble, "You know who that is, right?" Sophia looked at her. "His name is Matteo." Daniela gave her a look that was roughly equal parts disbelief and concern for Sophia's continued health and well-being. "Sophia." She lowered her voice to something barely above a breath. "That's Matteo Romano." "Okay." "Sophia. Romano. As in the Romano family." Sophia looked across the restaurant at the man sitting alone in the corner with the wine list he hadn't opened. "What about the Romano family?" she said, because she knew the name had some weight to it. She had grown up in Chicago, and the name Romano existed in a certain stratum of civic awareness, but she had never had occasion to connect it to anything specific. Daniela looked at her with the expression of a person deciding how much to say. "Let's just say that when men like Luca Moretti have a problem with someone," she said carefully, "they don't bring that problem to a Romano." Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Luca doesn't know who he is." Daniela tilted her head. "How sure are you about that?" She was, it turned out, exactly wrong. She learned this, not that evening. That evening passed without incident. Matteo drank his Barolo and ate his Bronzino and left another tip that made Daniela make a sound when she saw it. But Saturday morning at 7:42, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, and she answered it out of the half-awake instinct to do so. "You made a mistake," Luca said. She was immediately completely awake. "Don't call this number." "I'll call whatever number I want," he said, and his voice had the particular quality it got when he was performing calm. The tight, controlled quality of a man gripping something very hard and trying to make his hands look relaxed. "Do you understand what you did? Letting him get involved. Do you understand who you pulled into this?" "I didn't pull anyone into anything. You came into my restaurant and—" "Matteo Romano Sophia." He said the name the way you'd say the name of a weather event, with a kind of furious, incredulous awe. "Do you have any idea? Do you have any concept of what that name means in this city?" "Luca, don't call me again." He intervened. He personally intervened. Luca's voice was doing something she'd never heard it do. It was cracking slightly at the edges, the way a surface cracks when the pressure beneath it exceeds the structural capacity. "Do you know what I had to find out this week? Do you know what my brother had to tell me? That the man who told me to let go of your wrist is the same man whose organization controls half the shipping on the South Side. That's who you've gotten mixed up with, Sophia. That's whose attention you've attracted. I didn't attract anything. He sat in my section, and you... Stop. The crack in his voice smoothed over again. Suddenly, the way ice reforms over disturbed water. When he continued, he was back to the version of Luca she found most frightening, the quiet one. The careful one. I need you to understand something. I don't care who he is. I don't care about his name or his organization, or what he thinks gives him the right to interfere in a private matter between you and me. You are still... She hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed in the early morning, and looked at her hands, and waited for them to stop shaking. They took a while. She was familiar with the aftermath of conversations with Luca. The specific combination of rage and fear and self-recrimination. The voice in her head that sounded like him telling her she'd handled it wrong, she'd made it worse. She should have said something different, or nothing at all. She had gotten better at recognizing that voice and identifying it as his and not hers. She was getting better at it every day, but it still showed up unbidden every time. When her hands were steady, she went to her apron, which was hanging on the hook by her front door, and she put her hand in the pocket and she took out the business card. If he comes back. She turned it over. There was nothing on the other side, just the plain white of it, a little creased from days in her apron pocket. She stared at the number. She told herself she didn't need to call, that this was her problem, that she had handled Luca for 3 years and survived, and she could handle a phone call and a man who was frightened and trying to reassert himself. She told herself all the logical, self-sufficient, independent things she had been building the architecture of her life on for 11 months. Then she thought about the way Luca's voice had cracked when he said the name Romano. The specific, involuntary quality of it, the fissure of genuine fear in a man who had, in her experience, never been genuinely afraid of anything. She called the number. It rang twice. Sophia, Matteo said. She pulled the phone from her ear and looked at it for one startled second. How did you... I gave you the only number I gave to no one else this week, he said. There was something in his voice, not quite warmth, but that adjacent thing again, the thing she couldn't name. He called you. It wasn't a question. She's... This morning, 7:42. What did he say? She told him. She kept it brief, the tone of the call, the name, the particular quality of Luca's voice when he said, Romano. When she finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Are you at home? Matteo asked. Yes. Stay there this morning. A pause. Not because you have to, because I'd like to be certain of where you are while I make a few calls. She found somewhat to her own surprise that she wasn't offended by this. What kind of calls? The kind that remind certain people that some matters are closed. She sat with that for a moment. He said he doesn't care who you are. He does, Matteo said simply. He's frightened. Frightened men say things they have to unsay later. It's an embarrassing position. There was a pause, and then something that might have been the ghost of dry amusement moved through his voice. Usually they come to their senses. And if he doesn't, then we have a different conversation, Matteo said. But I don't think it comes to that. She sat with the business card in one hand and the phone in the other, and looked at her apartment, the 2 rooms she had built her independence in, the bookshelf she'd put together herself from flat-pack pieces, and her own stubbornness, the window above the street where the light came in every morning and reminded her she'd made it to another one. Why are you doing this? She asked. The pause that followed was a fraction longer than his other ones. Tuesday night, he said, your ex-boyfriend stood in a room full of people and said things to you in a language he believed protected him from consequences. He believed the language made him invisible. Another pause. I find that particular variety of cowardice very difficult to ignore. Most people manage, she said. Most people weren't sitting 10 feet away, he said. And most people didn't understand every word. She looked at the number on the card in her hand. You speak perfect Italian, she said. Not learned Italian. You grew up with it. My grandmother, he said. She spoke nothing else until she was 60. We spoke Italian at the dinner table every night for the first 15 years of my life. You don't forget a language that lived in your body that young. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her. He seemed to know it. There was a slight quality of recalibration in the beat that followed, like a man who has said something he hadn't planned and is deciding whether he minds. He didn't pursue it. Instead, he said, "Stay home this morning. I'll call you before noon." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. And then, with that same simple directness that she was starting to realize was simply how he operated, with no ornamentation and no performance. "But I'm going to." He hung up. She put the phone down. She put the business card on her kitchen counter where she could see it. She made coffee and stood at her window and watched the street below and thought about a man who had grown up speaking Italian at a dinner table every night, and about how a language learned in the body as a child never really leaves, and about how Luca had believed that same language was a weapon only he could wield. He had miscalculated in a way that was only going to become clearer with time. Matteo Romano had made over the course of his adult life a particular kind of peace with the fact that most people's understanding of who he was bore essentially no relationship to who he actually was. This was not unusual in his world. It came with the name, with the family, with the particular history of the Romano organization in Chicago. A history that stretched back 3 generations and had touched at various points nearly every corner of the city's business landscape in ways that were not always visible from the outside. People had ideas about what that meant. Most of those ideas were shaped by things they'd seen in movies, which Matteo found, when he thought about it, more exhausting than frightening. I was not a man who frightened easily. This was not a boast, it was simply a fact about his particular psychology. The same way it was a fact that he was fluent in Italian and preferred wine to liquor and had never learned to play golf despite 20 years of business associates suggesting he should. He had evaluated fear early in his life and found it structurally useful in some situations and corrosive in others, and he had made precise, deliberate choices about when to allow it to function. What he was, in ways the movies never captured, was methodical, patient, genuinely interested in understanding the full dimensions of a situation before deciding what it required of him. He had been interested in the full dimensions of Luca Moretti since Tuesday night. It hadn't taken long to assemble the picture. Luca was not a man with genuine connections to anything serious. His background was in commercial real estate. His money was largely inherited. His confidence was the specific variety that accrues in people who have never been required to face a real consequence. He was not dangerous in the organizational sense. He was dangerous in the way that cornered, ego-driven men are dangerous unpredictably, disproportionately, in ways that could cause significant harm to the person nearest to them when the pressure built past a certain point. That person was Sofia. Matteo had sat across a restaurant table from enough men like Luca to know the pattern with precision. He knew what 3 years of that kind of relationship did to a person. He knew the specific calibration of damage the way it lived, not in dramatic events, but in the accumulated weight of small moments. 1,000 tiny corrections to who you were allowed to be 1,000. Quiet messages that you were less than you thought. Until one day you looked in the mirror and found that the person looking back seemed to have no edges anymore. No definite shape had been eroded slowly and completely by a man who called it love. He had seen it happen to someone close to him once. He had not intervened then because he had been young and uncertain, and the situation had belonged to someone else, and he had told himself it wasn't his place. He had watched what happened afterward, and he had made himself a private and absolute promise that he would not make that calculation again. When he sat at the corner table of Bella Vita on Tuesday night and heard a man use Italian to deliver threats to a woman who could not deflect them, that private promise had activated so immediately and completely that he'd barely experienced the decision as a decision. He'd simply stood up. He was still standing up. That was what the phone calls on Saturday morning amounted to. He was still standing. 3 calls. 40 minutes total. He spoke to 2 men who understood immediately and completely what he was communicating, that Luca Moretti was to understand his involvement in Sofia Bennett's life was finished, that this was not a negotiation, that the Romano name was attached to this matter, and the Romano name resolved matters. The 3rd call was to a man Matteo trusted for information, who confirmed in under 5 minutes that Luca had been making inquiries about Matteo's background all week, had discovered exactly what he'd discovered, and was currently suspended between the paralysis of genuine fear and the dangerous instability of a man whose ego couldn't process the concept of retreat. That third call was the one that concerned him. He called Sophia at 11:47. She picked up on the first ring. "Well," she said, and the word was pure unguarded anxiety, no preamble, no pretense. And something about that directness, about the fact that she'd dropped the performance of being fine for long enough to ask the actual question, made him want to give her an answer that was equally honest. "He's been told," Matteo said. "Through the right people in language he understands. The message is clear." "But," she said, because she heard it in his voice, the place where the sentence should have ended and didn't. "He's not a predictable man right now," Matteo said. "Men like that, when they're frightened and their pride is damaged at the same time, they sometimes do things that don't serve their own interests. Things that are purely about pride, not strategy." The silence on her end lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "So you're saying it might not be over?" "I'm saying it might get worse before it's over," he said. "And I want you to be ready for that." "I've been ready for it for 11 months, she said. "That's the thing about leaving someone like Luca. You don't stop being ready. You just get tired of being ready." Matteo was quiet for a moment. "Have dinner with me," he said. The silence that followed was a different kind. "That's..." She seemed to be looking for the word. "That's a significant change of subject." "It's not," he said. "It's connected. I want to talk to you, not on the phone, not in your section at the restaurant where you work. Somewhere you're not managing something or somebody." A pause. "Unless that's not something you want." She was quiet for long enough that he gave her the space to be quiet. He had the patience for it. He had always had the patience for it. "You're a very strange person," she said finally. "People say that," he said. It wasn't a criticism. "I know." Another pause, shorter. "Saturday night," she said. "I'm free Saturday night." "I'll pick you up at 7, he said. "Text me your address." "I haven't given you my number." "You called me from it this morning," he said. And there it was again, not quite warmth, but that adjacent thing. "I'm methodical." He heard something on her end that was almost not quite a laugh. It was a sound that arrived without warning and seemed to surprise her as much as anything, and it lingered in the line for just a moment before she got it back under control. 7 o'clock, she said. "Saturday." "Saturday," he confirmed. He put the phone down. He looked at the wall of his office, a space that most people who saw it expected to be different than it was, more theatrical, more cinematic, more closely aligned with whatever version of a powerful man's office they'd constructed in their imagination. It was a plain room with a large desk and good light, and books he'd actually read arranged on shelves without particular organization, and a single photograph on the wall that was of the lake at a particular hour, in a particular season, and had nothing to do with power or demonstration. I thought about a woman who had spent 3 years being reduced by a man who mistook her patience for weakness and her kindness for compliance. He thought about Tuesday night, the way she'd kept her chin level even when her hands were shaking. The way she'd said, "I'm fine," the way someone says it when they're fine, and also when they've been saying it so long, it's become structural, the load-bearing wall of how they move through the world. He thought about the laugh that had surprised her. He picked up his phone and made one more call. The fourth call of the morning, the one he hadn't mentioned to Sophia. The one that was in some ways the most important of the 4. "I need you to watch a name," he said, when the person on the other end picked up. "Luca Moretti, commercial real estate. I want to know if he moves where he goes, who he talks to, and especially if he talks to anyone who makes you uncomfortable." "How tight?" the person on the other end asked. "Tight enough that I know before he acts," Matteo said. "Not so tight that he knows he's being watched. I don't want him frightened into something stupid." "And if he moves toward the woman?" Matteo's answer was immediate, flat, and completely without ambiguity. "Then I want to know about it before he reaches her." He hung up. Outside his window, Chicago moved through a gray November morning in complete ignorance of the fact that a very quiet, very patient man had decided that a woman he'd met 4 days ago was someone worth standing up for. Not because she was helped. He had already understood with some precision that she was anything but helpless. but because helpless had nothing to do with it. Because a man had used a language like a weapon, counting on invisibility to protect him, and the invisibility had failed, and the man still hadn't understood what that meant. He would. Matteo Romano had all the patience in the world, and Luca Moretti was only beginning to understand what it cost in this city to fail to listen when the quiet man in the corner told you to let go. She changed her outfit 4 times. Sophia stood in her apartment on Saturday evening and looked at the 4 versions of herself she had rejected and told herself firmly that this was a business meeting. A practical arrangement between 2 adults who had a shared problem named Luca Moretti. It was not a date. Matteo Romano had not asked her on a date. He had asked her to dinner so they could talk, which was different, which was entirely practical, and which did not require her to have spent 40 minutes standing in front of her closet, treating each outfit like a character she was auditioning to play. She put on the navy dress. It was the first one she'd tried, and the one she'd kept coming back to, and the fact that she'd wasted 40 minutes arriving at the answer. Her instincts had given her in the first 30 seconds. Was she decided a symptom of something she was going to examine later? Not now. I was outside at 7 exactly. Not 7:01. Not 6:58. 7 o'clock, the way someone arrives when punctuality is not a performance, but simply the baseline expression of how they operate. The car was dark and clean, and there was a driver, which she'd half expected and still found slightly disorienting. Not the wealth of it, but the casual normalcy with which he inhabited it, the complete absence of any gesture toward impressing her with the fact of it. He looked at her when she got in. Just a look, the kind that takes you in honestly, without manufacturing meaning, without the performance of appreciation that certain men produced whenever a woman put effort into her appearance. He said, "You look well," and it landed the way the truest compliments do, as observation rather than transaction. "You're very punctual," she said. "It's a habit," he said. "My grandmother believed that being late communicated to people that your time was more valuable than theirs." A pause. "I think she was right. Your grandmother sounds formidable." "She was the most formidable person I've ever known," he said without hesitation. "And I have known some formidable people." She thought about the name Romano, and the weight Daniela had put on it, and the way Luca's voice had cracked on the phone saying it. "I believe you," she said. They went to a restaurant she'd never been to, small Italian, with the particular quality of places that don't need to announce their own excellence. The kind of restaurant that assumes you know what you're doing by the time you arrive. The host knew Matteo by name, not with the performance of recognition, but the genuine warmth of a long-standing familiarity, and they were seated at a corner table. Naturally, she thought he would always choose the corner and given menus and left alone. She looked at the menu. He didn't open his. "You've been here before," she said. "Once a week for 11 years, he said. "The branzino here is better than the branzino at Bellavita. I apologize for the implication." "I just serve it, she said. "I'm not attached to its quality." She set the menu down. "You're going to have the branzino." "I am." "You don't need to look at the menu to know that." "I never do." She looked at him across the table. The restaurant around them was quiet in the particular way of Saturday evenings when people have settled into their meals and stopped performing for each other. "Can I ask you something directly?" "Yes," he said with the tone of a man for whom this was the only way he wanted to be asked things. "How much do you know about me?" she said. "Not from Tuesday. Not from what I told you on the phone. Before all of that. Did you look me up after Tuesday night?" He didn't look away. "Yes." She had expected him to qualify it or soften it or wrap it in explanation. He simply said yes and waited. "And," she said, "and I found what I expected to find," he said. Someone who had been in a relationship with a man who specialized in making people feel smaller than they were. Someone who left that relationship on her own, which is harder than people who haven't done it tend to understand. Someone who has been rebuilding methodically for almost a year. He paused. Someone whose instincts about people are good, which I suspect survived the relationship better than her confidence in those instincts did. The accuracy of it landed somewhere deep and slightly painful, the way the truth lands when someone sees you clearly without being invited to. That's a lot, she said. You asked directly, he said. I did. She picked up her water glass. Most people, when they look someone up, they find what they expected to find, and then they feel like they know them. I found what I expected, he said. I don't confuse that with knowing you. The waiter came. Matteo ordered the branzino without looking up. Sophia ordered the pasta and a glass of the Barolo, and after the waiter left, the conversation shifted not abruptly, but the way conversations shift between people who are both paying attention, following the natural current of it. She asked about his grandmother. She wasn't sure why, except that it was the first personal thing he'd offered voluntarily. And she had an instinct. One of those instincts. He'd apparently noticed that personal things offered voluntarily by Matteo Romano were rare enough to be worth following. He talked about her for 15 minutes. It was the longest continuous stretch of unprompted speech she'd heard from him. His grandmother had come from a town near Palermo, had arrived in Chicago at 19, with $40, and a ferocious certainty that she understood more about the world than it had yet given her credit for. She had been right. She had built a business, small a bakery of all things, and she had run it herself, and she had raised children, and she had demanded Italian at the dinner table, because she said a person who lost their first language lost the place where their soul had been put together, and she had been fierce and funny, and she had never in Matteo's experience of her been afraid of anything or anyone. She sounds like someone I would have wanted to know, Sophia said. She would have liked you, he said. And then, as though surprised by the certainty of it, she had very particular taste in people. She didn't like pretension. She used to say she liked people who knew the difference between being quiet and being empty. People who could be still without being absent. He paused. You're not empty when you're quiet. Sophia looked at him. You've noticed me being quiet. Tuesday night, he said, after I came back to my table. You went back to your section, and you did your job, and you were perfectly composed, and you looked at me twice, maybe 3 times, and each time I could see you were processing something, not performing recovery. There's a difference. She didn't know what to say to that. She said, most people don't make that distinction. Most people aren't paying attention, he said. The food came. They ate. The conversation moved through other territories, her bakery plan, which she explained with the specific combination of passion and apologetic understatement that she'd developed as a defense against people who found small dreams easier to dismiss than large ones. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention, no interruption, and then asked 3 questions that were so precisely targeted at the actual structural challenges of the plan that she had to stop and look at him. You know something about small business, she said. I know something about most things, he said without arrogance, purely a statement of fact. The specific numbers work. The location you're considering on Damon is correctly priced for the foot traffic. Your timeline is slightly optimistic if you're doing this without partners, but not unrealistically so. He paused. You've done real work on this. 2 years of real work, she said. Started the plan when I was still with Luca. She said at his name without flinching, which she noticed, which felt like something. He thought it was a hobby. He called it my little project. She picked up her wine glass. The first time someone takes your dream and calls it a hobby, you think they're just being thoughtless. The second time you start to wonder if they're right. The 15th time... She stopped. The 15th time you stop talking about it in front of them, Matteo said quietly. She looked at him. Yes. And you put it somewhere safe, he said, and you take it out when they're not there, and you keep working on it. And that becomes how you know it's real, because you're still working on it, even when there's no audience for it. The table was very quiet. Yes, she said. That's exactly what happened. He looked at her with that expression she'd been trying to name since Tuesday. Not warmth exactly, but something that lived in the same country as warmth. Something that felt like the particular quality of being genuinely seen by someone who could have looked away and chose not to. She understood sitting there that Matteo Romano was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and that meant everything he'd said in the last 2 hours was the precise, unornamented truth. That was when her phone buzzed. She almost didn't look at it. She had made herself a rule years ago about phones at dinner, a rule that predated Luca and would outlast him. but something made her glance at the notification, and what she saw made her hand go still against the table. It was not Luca's number. It was a number she didn't recognize. The message said, "Ask your new friend what happened to the last man who got between Romano and something he wanted. Ask him about the Ferrante situation. Then decide if you're safe." She put the phone face down on the table. Her heart was doing something complicated and fast. Matteo saw it. He saw her face change before she had the chance to compose it, and his expression sharpened, not with alarm, but with the focused, immediate quality of a man whose attention had just received new information and was already processing it. "What is it?" he said. She turned the phone over and passed it across the table. He read the message. He read it once, and then he set the phone down on the table between them with the particular deliberateness of a man managing his own reaction. "Luca," she said. "Or someone he paid," Matteo said. "Is it true?" she said. "The Ferrante situation, whatever that is it something I should know about?" The way he looked at her in that moment would stay with her for a long time afterward. Because it was not the look of a man calculating what he could get away with, not telling her which was the look she'd been trained by 3 years of Luca to watch for. It was the look of a man deciding how to tell the complete truth with appropriate context. The Ferrante situation, he said, was 4 years ago. Marco Ferrante was a business associate who decided that a contract he'd agreed to was something he could simply walk away from when a better offer came along, while the people on the other side of that contract suffered significant financial harm. He paused. "I made certain that Marco Ferrante understood in terms that were clear and final that walking away had consequences he hadn't accounted for. He was not physically harmed. He was economically and professionally ruined, which in his case was considerably more painful." Another pause. "Someone who knows about that situation and is choosing to present it to you without context is trying to make you afraid of me. Whoever sent this message wants you to see me as a threat. And should I?" she said. He met her eyes without deflection. "I am a man with a complicated history and significant power in this city," he said. "I have done things that were necessary, that were not always clean. I will not pretend otherwise, but I have never in my life directed harm toward someone who did not first direct harm toward others." He held her gaze. "You are not in danger from me. I cannot prove that to you except by being the person I am telling you I am over time, but I'm telling you clearly." The silence between them had a different quality now, denser with more in it. "He's escalating," she said. This wasn't Luca making a frightened phone call at 7 in the morning. This was Luca doing research and building a strategy. "Yes," Matteo said. "Which means the calls you made Saturday didn't stop him. They just made him more deliberate." "Yes," he said again. He looked at her across the table with something that might have been respect, the specific variety of respect that a person earns by arriving at an accurate and unwelcome conclusion without flinching from it. "He's not done. And now he's trying to isolate you from the one resource that complicates his plan." "Me," she said. "I'm the resource." "You," he said. "And the fact that you're not alone." She picked up her wine glass. She did it slowly, and she drank, and she set the glass back down, and she looked at Matteo Romano across a table in a restaurant he'd been coming to for 11 years, and she made a decision. "What do we do?" she said. The "we" was deliberate. He heard it. "We finish dinner," he said. "Then I'm going to take you home, and I'm going to have someone outside your building tonight. Not visible, not intrusive, just present. And tomorrow, I'm going to find out exactly who sent that message, because a man with Luca's ego doesn't pay someone to do something like this without leaving traces." He paused. "And then we have a different kind of conversation with Luca Moretti." "Different how?" "More direct," Matteo said. "Until now, I've communicated through intermediaries. That's the standard. It leaves people room to save face, which usually resolves things." His voice was still even, still quiet, still occupying that register just above a whisper that she was starting to understand was not softness, but precision. A man who had learned that the quieter you were, the more carefully people listened. "But Luca isn't using the room. He's using it to build a case instead of accepting a resolution. So you talk to him directly," she said. "So I talked to him directly," he confirmed. "And what does that look like?" He looked at her for a moment. "It looks like a conversation he will not forget," he said, "and after which he will make different decisions." She understood that the specifics of what those different decisions would cost Luca were things Matteo was not going to detail over Branzino and Barolo on a Saturday night. And she understood, too, that she was choosing in this moment to trust that the man across from her was who he said he was, someone who directed consequences toward people who caused harm, and not toward people who were simply nearby. "Okay," she said. He looked slightly surprised by that. Not much. Matteo Romano's face was not a face that showed surprise in large gestures, but slightly. "Okay. Okay," she said again. "Finish dinner. Someone outside my building. You find the trace. Direct conversation with Luca." She picked up her fork. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not scared, but I'm also not going to pretend I don't have choices. And my choice is that I trust you." The thing that moved across his face then was not the adjacent to warmth quality she'd been cataloging. It was the actual thing. "A small thing," he said, "given your history." "No," she said, "it isn't." They finished dinner. He took her home. The driver pulled up outside her building, and Matteo walked her to the door. And there was a moment on the sidewalk that was the specific, slightly suspended kind of moment that exists between two people who are both aware. Something is changing, and neither is certain at what speed it should change. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "Thank you for trusting me with the phone," he said. He meant the message. He meant the decision she'd made in the 30 seconds between reading the message and passing the phone across the table. "Good night, Matteo." "Good night, Sophia." She went inside. She did not look back through the lobby glass to see if he was still standing there, because she was a woman who had spent 3 years trained to monitor whether a man approved of her exits, and she was done with that. She found out later that he stood there for 4 minutes before getting back in the car. She did not find that out from him. Sunday passed quietly in the way that precedes things that are not quiet. Sophia made her recipes. She measured flour and tested ratios and wrote notes in her notebook in the margins of plans that were getting closer to being real, and she kept her phone on the counter where she could see it, and the phone was silent, and the silence had 2 possible meanings, and she was working very hard on believing it was the good one. Matteo called at 3 in the afternoon. The message last night was sent from a prepaid phone purchased Friday at a store in Logan Square, he said without preamble. The person who purchased it is a man named Declan Morrow. He does occasional work for Luca, research mostly, sometimes deliveries. A pause. He made a mistake. What kind of mistake? The kind that leaves a trail, Matteo said. Declan Morrow is going to have a conversation today with someone I trust. After that conversation, he's going to call Luca and tell him that the research project is finished, that he's no longer available, and that he advises Luca strongly to let the matter go. And Luca will listen to that, Sophia said. Luca will understand after that conversation that his attempts to gather information and use it against me have been visible and documented, and that continuing makes his situation significantly worse. Another pause. The trace he thought he was building I now have instead. He knows things he thought were private. I know things he thought were invisible. She sat with that. You're saying the leverage shifted. Completely, Matteo said. And Luca is smart enough at the core underneath the ego to understand what that means. So it's over, she said. The pause was short, but she heard everything inside it. There's one more step, he said. I need to see him in person. It's the only way to be certain. When? Tomorrow, he said. I've already arranged it. How, she said. He's not going to agree to meet you. He won't be given the choice of not meeting me, Matteo said. And there was something in his voice when he said that, not a threat exactly, not menace, but the calm, absolute factual quality of someone describing physics. He'll be told that the meeting is happening, and that his attendance is in the language my people use, strongly encouraged. Sophia was quiet for a moment. And after that meeting, Matteo said, Luca Moretti is finished with you, completely, finally. Without the possibility of reconsideration. She believed him. The certainty of it moved through her, not because he'd said the right things, not because she needed to believe it, but because over the course of 6 days, she had watched Matteo Romano operate with a consistency of method and result. That was, she was beginning to understand the most fundamental thing about him. He did not make promises. He stated outcomes. "Can I ask you something else?" she said. "Yes. This morning when you were figuring out who sent the message, finding the trace, arranging the meeting, what were you thinking about?" A long pause. Longer than his others. He said. "I was thinking about the fact that you passed me the phone instead of handling it alone. And that before you passed it to me, you had already worked out what it meant and what it probably implied about Luca's next move. And I was thinking that you did all of that in about 30 seconds and then made a decision." Another pause. "I was thinking that you are significantly more formidable than you've been given credit for being." She looked at her notebook on the counter. The recipe margins. 2 years of work on a dream that someone had called a hobby 15 times. "I'm working on knowing that," she said. "You'll get there," he said. He said it with the same quality as everything else. Not encouragement, not performance, but simple factual statement from a man who had looked at the evidence and arrived at a conclusion. "Monday," she said. "The meeting with Luca. I want you to tell me what happens." "I'll tell you everything," he said. She put the phone down. She looked at her notebook and her flower measurements and the plan that was 2 years of quiet stolen private work kept alive in the margins of a relationship that had tried to make it small. Luca had called it a hobby. Matteo Romano had looked at the specific numbers and called the timeline slightly optimistic. She knew with a certainty that had no drama in it which of those assessments she was going to build her life on. She picked up her pen and went back to work. And 45 blocks away, in a Saturday evening that was running out of hours, Luca Moretti received a phone call from Declan Morrow, listened to 30 seconds of it, and understood for the first time with physical cold, complete clarity that he had made a mistake he could not strategize his way out of. The question that kept him awake that night was not how to fix it. It was how bad the meeting tomorrow was going to be. Luca Moretti did not sleep Sunday night. He knew this with the particular exhausted clarity of a man who had spent 8 hours in bed and arrived at Monday morning having rested nothing. Not his body, not his mind, and certainly not the part of him that kept running the same calculation over and over and arriving at the same answer, which was that the ground he had been standing on since Tuesday had been quietly, methodically, completely removed from beneath him without his noticing until there was nothing left to stand on. He had built the week on a premise. The premise was that Matteo Romano was a name, a significant name, a name that warranted caution and strategy, but still ultimately a man, and men could be managed if you understood their motivations. He had studied Romano's public profile. He had called his brother, who had connections that Luca had always treated as a safety net. And his brother had told him plainly that this was not a net that would hold Romano's weight, but Luca had filed that away under fear-talking and proceeded with his plan. He had hired Declan Morrow to dig. He had assembled the Ferrante information. He had sent the message to Sophia's phone on Saturday night with the specific satisfied feeling of a man who has found the lever he needs. By Sunday afternoon, Declan Morrow had called him and dismantled every piece of that structure in 30 seconds. Not with hostility. That was the part that stayed with him, the complete quiet absence of hostility in Declan's voice, which Luca had processed slowly, and then understood all at once as something more frightening than hostility. It was the absence of hostility in a man delivering a devastating message, because the person who had asked him to deliver it had no need for hostility. Hostility was the language of people who were unsure if they were winning. Romano was not unsure. The meeting was set for 11 Monday morning. Luca's brother had called Sunday evening to tell him in the very specific tone of a man who loves his sibling and has run out of patience for that sibling's decisions, that he should go to the meeting, that he should go quietly, and that under no circumstances should he walk into that room with anything other than complete willingness to resolve the matter. "This isn't a negotiation, Luca," his brother said. "Understand what I'm telling you. This is a courtesy. He's giving you a room and a chair and the opportunity to close this like an adult instead of the alternative." "What's the alternative?" Luca had said. His brother had been silent for 3 seconds. "Don't find out." Luca spent Sunday night rebuilding himself. That was the only word for it, the specific, exhausting internal labor of a man who has been genuinely frightened and needs to reconstruct enough ego to walk into a room the next morning without showing what the previous 48 hours had done to him. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. He had spent his adult life presenting a version of himself that was polished and confident and impenetrable, and that version had served him in boardrooms and negotiations and difficult conversations, and he called on it now with everything he had. By 10:30 Monday morning, he was dressed and composed, and telling himself with the portion of his brain that still believed it, that Romano was a man, and men could be managed, and he had walked out of worse situations than this. He had not walked out of worse situations than this. He just didn't know that yet. The location was a private dining room above an Italian restaurant on the near north side. Not Bella Vita, somewhere older, quieter, with the particular atmosphere of a place that had hosted conversations like this one for decades and had the discretion built into its walls. Luca was shown in by a man who said nothing and indicated the chair across the table from where Matteo Romano was already sitting. That was the first recalibration. The small deliberate signal that Romano had been here long enough to be settled, and Luca was the one who had entered the room, which meant Romano owned the room, and Luca was a guest in it. Matteo looked exactly as he had on Tuesday night. Dark suit, no tie, the quality of stillness that Luca had spent a week trying to characterize, and had finally landed on, as the stillness of a man who has never needed to fill silence to feel powerful in it. There was coffee on the table. No food. A water glass. Nothing that suggested this was going to take long. Luca sat down. He opened his mouth. Matteo said, "Don't." One word. Not loud. Not hostile. Delivered the way you'd say, "don't" to someone about to make an error they'd regret, purely practical, almost kind. Luca closed his mouth. "I'm going to talk," Matteo said. "You're going to listen. When I'm finished, you can say one thing, and that one thing is either yes or no. That's the entire structure of this conversation." He looked at Luca across the table with the complete unblinking attention that Luca had been unsettled by on Tuesday, and found at this proximity across a small table significantly more unsettling. "Do you understand?" Luca understood that nodding was the only acceptable response. He nodded. "Good," Matteo said. He picked up his coffee cup, drank once, set it down. Completely unhurried. The specific unhurriedness of a man who has nowhere else to be, because this matter is getting resolved before he goes anywhere else. "I want to tell you what I know," he said. "Not to threaten you. To demonstrate that the picture you have of this situation is incomplete, and that the decisions you've been making this week have been made on the basis of that incomplete picture, and that it would be genuinely useful for you to have the full picture before you make any more decisions." Luca said nothing. He was listening. He had no other option. "Sophia Bennett," Matteo said, "left a relationship with you 11 months ago. In that relationship over 3 years, you used criticism as control, isolation, as management, and language specifically. Italian as a private channel for threats you believed were invisible to anyone outside the two of you." He paused. "They weren't invisible to me. Tuesday night I heard every word you said to her. Every word. The part about belonging to you. The part about permission. The part about her not being able to run far enough." He set the coffee cup down. "I want you to understand that you said those things in front of a witness who understood them completely. That matters legally. That matters in other ways too." Luca felt something cold move through him. "After Tuesday," Matteo continued, "you made phone calls. You found my name. You hired Declan Moro to research me. You found the Ferrante situation, which you then packaged without context and sent to Sophia's phone on Saturday night with the specific intention of frightening her away from someone who was protecting her." He looked at Luca steadily. "The strategy was to isolate her. It's the same strategy you used throughout your relationship with her. Remove her support. Make her feel that no one and nothing can help her and step back into the resulting vacuum. It's the only play you know. The accuracy of it delivered with zero emotion. No contempt. Just the flat precision of a man reading a diagnosis was worse than anything Luca had imagined the meeting would feel like. "Here is what you did not know," Matteo said, and his voice shifted slightly, not louder, not harder, but with a quality of absolute terminal certainty, that arrived in the room and took up all the available space. Declan Morrow did not simply tell you the project was finished. He documented everything you asked him to find, and everything he found it, and provided that documentation to me. I now have a complete record of your research, your communications, the specific information you attempted to weaponize, and the timeline of your attempts to undermine a situation you had no standing to be involved in. He paused. Additionally, the phone call you made to Sophia on Saturday morning 7:42 was recorded. Her phone, not at my request. She made that decision herself. Another pause. The content of that call is not something you want in anyone else's hands. Luca's carefully reconstructed composure was doing something he could feel from the inside, losing structural integrity. The way a building loses it, not dramatically but progressively, one load-bearing element at a time. I have all of this, Matteo said, and I have no particular interest in using it. I'm not in the business of destroying men who are simply frightened and making poor decisions. It's not efficient, and it's not interesting. He folded his hands on the table, the first gesture he'd made, and somehow the most deliberate feeling one. What I want from you is simple. Complete and final disengagement from Sophia Bennett's life. No calls, no visits, no intermediaries, no messages through people you've paid, no presence in any space she occupies, nothing. He met Luca's eyes. And I want your word on it. Not because your word is what's securing this, the documentation is what's securing this, but because I want you to have said it out loud in a room to another person, so it lives somewhere other than only inside your head. Silence. Luca was looking at the table. He was doing the calculation that Matteo had known he would do, the same calculation every man in this chair had done, the rapid and ultimately futile search for the exit. That wasn't the obvious one. The angle that hadn't been accounted for, the leverage he might still have. There wasn't one. He could feel the absence of it. There's something else you should know, Matteo said. Luca looked up. Sophia Bennett did not ask me to protect her, Matteo said. She didn't come to me. She didn't use me. She didn't cultivate a relationship with me as a strategy against you. She served me wine in a restaurant where she was working, and I sat in the corner and heard a man use the language of my grandmother to say things to a woman that my grandmother would have found unforgivable. Something moved through his voice. Not anger, but the particular gravity of a man touching something that actually means something to him. I intervened because of what I heard, not because of who she was or who you were, because of what I heard. He paused. I want you to understand that. Because the version of this you've been building in your head, the version where Sophia orchestrated this, where she's using powerful people, where she's running a strategy against you, that version doesn't exist. It's something you invented, so you didn't have to face the simpler truth. And what's the simpler truth? Luca said. It came out quieter than he intended. That she left, Matteo said. That's it. She made a decision, and she left, and she's been rebuilding her life for 11 months, and you cannot tolerate that, because tolerating it would require you to accept that she had the right to make that decision. And you've never believed she had that right. He looked at Luca with something that was not contempt. It was almost clinical, the way a doctor looks at a condition they've diagnosed many times. That's not my business to fix. That's yours. But while you're fixing it, Sophia Bennett is no longer part of your world. Not in any form. The room was very quiet. Luca looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the water glass. He looked at the door that the silent man had closed behind him when he came in, and he understood with complete physical certainty that the silent man was still on the other side of it, and that everything in this room had already been decided before he sat down. Yes, he said. One word. The word Matteo had told him he would say. Matteo nodded. That was all, a single nod, the way you acknowledge a transaction completed. He reached for his coffee again. The gesture was so ordinary, so completely free of ceremony, that it communicated more clearly than any words could have that the meeting was over and Luca was free to go. Luca stood up. He straightened his jacket, the same automatic gesture Sophia had watched him make on Tuesday night, and it meant the same thing now that it had meant then, a man trying to locate the version of himself that was still in control of something. He walked to the door. Luca, Matteo said. He stopped. He turned. Matteo was looking at him with an expression that he would think about for a very long time afterward. Not triumph. Not threat. Something that was almost bewilderingly closer to something like sadness. The specific sadness of a man who has seen the same thing too many times and finds no satisfaction in recognizing it again. "She's going to open a bakery," Matteo said. "On Damon. It's going to do well." A pause. "I thought you should know." Luca understood with the specific slow clarity of a man who has had something explained to him in a language he is only now learning exactly what those sentences meant and what they didn't mean and what they cost the man saying them to say in this room. He left without answering. The door closed behind him. Matteo sat alone in the room for a while after Luca left. He was not a man who processed things quickly. In the emotional sense, he processed facts quickly, strategy quickly, risk quickly. But the emotional dimensions of things moved through him on their own timeline, and he had learned over many years to give them the space they needed rather than filing them into efficiency. He thought about the meeting. He thought about the specific moment when Luca had said yes, the flatness of it, the way the last of the ego had drained out of the word, the sound of a man finally putting something down that he'd been carrying too long in the wrong direction. He hadn't felt satisfaction at that. He'd felt something more complicated, the residue of things that had been necessary and were now finished. He called Sophia. She picked up on the second ring. "Well," she said, and it was the same word she'd used on Saturday morning, the same pure, unguarded directness, and he was struck again by the particular quality of it. A woman who had been trained for years to manage her own visibility, choosing with him not to perform. "It's done," he said. A silence. Then, done, done. "Done, done," he said. He gave his word. He understands what backs that word up. He's not going to bother you again. The exhale on her end of the phone was the kind that comes from a depth of relief that hasn't had anywhere to go for a very long time. He heard the whole 11 months in it. Every morning she'd checked over her shoulder every unknown number on her phone. Every quiet evening interrupted by the low-grade vigilance of a woman who knew better than to believe she was completely safe. "Are you okay?" she said. The question surprised him enough that he paused before answering it. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because you just spent a week dealing with something that was my problem," she said, "and nobody has asked you that." He looked at the empty room, the untouched water glass, where Luca had been sitting, the door that had closed. "I'm fine," he said. And then, hearing his own echo of what she'd said on Tuesday night, he added, "That's probably not the complete answer." She made a sound, that sound again, the almost laugh that surprised her, the one that had nowhere to go and came out anyway. "You can tell me the rest later," she said. "Yes," he said. "I can." He meant it. He had not in recent memory meant a casual future tense sentence that fully. He took her to the bakery space on Damon the following Saturday. Not dramatically, he didn't arrive with an announcement or a gesture. He called and said he was going to be near the neighborhood, and did she want to walk through the space because he had some thoughts about the build-out timeline that might be useful. She said yes, with the specific voice of a woman who knows an understatement when she hears one and is choosing not to call it out. They walked through the empty space together. Sophia moved through it the way she moved through her section at Bella Vita, with the purposeful familiarity of someone who had been there in her mind so many times that the physical version was just confirming what she already knew. She talked about the layout, the equipment, the sourcing for the display cases. She talked about it with the fluency of someone who had been thinking about it privately for 2 years, and was only now letting someone else into the room where the thinking had been happening. Matteo listened. He asked questions. 3, then 4, each one landing exactly at the place where the plan had a seam that needed examining, the way someone who genuinely understands structures always finds the seam. "You've thought about this more than any business plan I've been shown in the last 5 years, he said at one point. "I've had more time with it," she said. "Most business plans I've been shown were assembled to impress someone. This one was assembled because it's real," he said. "Yes," she said. She was standing near the window, the light from Damon Avenue coming through, and she turned to look at him with an expression that was not performing gratitude or performing anything. Thank you, she said. For all of it. For Tuesday. For the phone call. For the meeting with Luca. She paused. For this. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. There's a difference. She held his gaze with the particular steadiness of a woman who has learned slowly, and at some cost, the difference between saying things because they're expected and saying them because they're true. You saw something in a restaurant on a Tuesday night that most people would have looked away from, and you didn't look away, and you kept not looking away all week. And that's not nothing, Matteo. That's one of the rarest things I've ever experienced. I was quiet for a moment. My grandmother, he said, used to say that the measure of a person was what they did when staying out of it was easier. She was right, Sophia said. She usually was. She smiled, a real one, the full version, the one that arrived without her managing it, and something in Matteo Romano that had been composed and controlled and professionally armored. For a very long time, felt that smile, the way you feel, unexpected warmth, with a kind of involuntary complete response that bypasses all the systems designed to regulate it. He looked at the empty bakery. He looked at the woman standing in the middle of her own future. The display cases, he said, because he was a man who lived in the practical, who trusted the practical, who had learned that the most honest form of caring was investing your attention in what actually mattered to someone. Should run along the north wall. The foot traffic from the entrance will move left naturally. You want them to move toward your best product, which should be the first thing they see. Sophia looked at the north wall. She looked at him. You've thought about this, she said. I think about things, he said. She pulled out her notebook, the same notebook he would learn later that she'd been carrying for 2 years. The one with the recipe margins and the floor plans and the financials, and she wrote something in it. What did you write? He said. She turned the notebook so he could see. Display cases north wall. He's right. And beneath it in smaller letters, the kind you write for yourself and not for an audience. He's right about most things. He looked at what she'd written. He looked at her. He said nothing because nothing needed to be said, and he was a man who understood that. She put the notebook back in her bag. They walked out together into the November Saturday, the street noise of Damon rising around them. Coffee shops and foot traffic, and the city moving through an ordinary afternoon in complete ignorance of the fact that a woman was one signed lease away from the thing she'd kept alive in her margins for 2 years, and that the man walking beside her had decided somewhere between a Tuesday corner booth and a Monday morning meeting, and a Saturday walk through an empty space that her future was something he wanted to be near, not in front of, not controlling, near. That distinction, Sophia thought as they walked, was everything, and somewhere across Chicago, Luca Moretti was sitting in his car outside a building that had nothing to do with her making his first phone call of the week, to someone that had nothing to do with her moving toward a version of Monday that she had no part in. He had said yes in a room on a Monday morning, and the woman he had once called his, the woman he had tried to make feel small and isolated, and powerless, and permanently. His was standing in the middle of her own future, writing notes in the margins, and the most dangerous man she had ever met was walking beside her asking about display cases. She couldn't decide if that was funny or beautiful. She decided it was both. The lease was signed on a Thursday morning in December. Sophia put the pen down and looked at the paper for a long moment before she picked it up and folded it and put it in her bag, and she did all of this without ceremony, because she had found in the 11 months since leaving Luca that the biggest moments of her life landed quietly. Not with fanfare, not with the audience she might have imagined when she was younger and still believed that the important things announced themselves. They arrived the way. Good things arrived when you had earned them slowly, simply, completely, like something that had always been true finally becoming visible. She called Matteo from the sidewalk outside the leasing office. He picked up on the first ring, which was unusual. He was the kind of man whose phone was frequently occupied by things she wasn't privy to, and she understood from the speed of it that he had been waiting for the call. Done, he said. Done, she said. North wall and everything. There was a pause, and in the pause she heard the thing she had learned to hear in his silences, not absence, but fullness. The specific fullness of a man who feels things at a depth that his composure doesn't always have room for on the surface. Good, he said. One word. But she had been learning his vocabulary long enough to know that this particular good, delivered at this particular depth, translated to something considerably more than its syllable count. Dinner tonight, he said. The usual place. The usual place, she said. And she was smiling before she finished saying it, because they had a usual place. Now that was the thing, that was the detail that kept arriving unexpectedly and catching her somewhere soft, that they had accumulated enough evenings together to have a usual place, a usual table, a usual order, a shorthand that had developed the way. Shorthand always does, gradually, and then all at once, until one day you look up and realize that another person has become part of the grammar of how you move through the world. She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk in December and let the cold air of the city hit her face and thought, I did this. I did this by myself, and I am not alone. Both of those things were true simultaneously. She was still working on letting them be. The bakery opened in March, not with a grand event. Sophia was not a grand event person and had never been, and the version of herself she was building had no interest in performing for an audience that would show up for an opening and never return. She opened on a Tuesday morning, which felt right, which felt like symmetry. She hadn't planned, but recognized immediately when she realized the day of the week. Tuesdays were when things changed for her. She was beginning to trust them. She made coffee and set out the first trays and opened the door at 7 in the morning, and the first customer was her sister, who had driven 40 minutes from the suburbs and arrived with wet eyes that she was pretending were from the cold. The second customer was Daniela from Bella Vita, who had already told everyone at the restaurant and arrived with the energy of a woman who has been waiting to say "I told you so" about a person's potential and is savoring her moment. The third customer was a woman. Sophia didn't know who had seen the sign in the window 2 weeks ago and written the opening date in her calendar, and who ordered 2 almond croissants and a coffee, and sat at the small table near the window, and stayed for an hour and a half, and who became in the weeks that followed one of Sophia's regulars. By 10 o'clock on that first Tuesday, every tray was half empty. By noon, 2 trays were completely gone. Sophia was behind the counter with flour on her hands and her hair coming loose from where she'd pinned it, and her feet aching from 4 hours on the tile floor, and she was the happiest she had been in longer than she could precisely trace. Matteo arrived at 12:30. I didn't announce it. He simply walked in, and the bell above the door rang, and Sophia looked up from the case she was restocking and found him standing near the entrance in his dark coat, looking around the space with the expression she had learned to read, the one that looked like neutrality, but was actually the careful, quiet process of a man absorbing something and assigning it its correct weight. He looked at the half-empty trays. He looked at the woman still sitting at the window table. He looked at the small handwritten menu board that Sophia had made herself at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, sitting on her kitchen floor because she'd run out of table space. He looked at her. "You're out of the almond croissants," he said. "Sold out by 9:45, she said. He came to the counter. He looked at what remained with the focused attention of a man making a genuine assessment. "The pistachio," he said. "2 left." "I'll have both," he said. "And the coffee." She made his coffee the way he liked it. She knew how he liked it. That was another thing that had happened gradually, and then all at once she knew how this man took his coffee, and she put the 2 pistachio pastries on a plate, and she slid it across the counter, and he paid, and their hands didn't touch during the transaction. And then he looked at her from the other side of the counter and said very quietly, "Sophia." "I know," she said, because she did. She knew what he was not saying, and she knew all the reasons it wasn't being said, and she knew the weight of it, and she knew that for a man like Matteo Romano, a man who had spent his entire adult life in a world where sentiment was a vulnerability and expression was a risk, standing in her bakery on a Tuesday at 12:30, with flour on the counter between them. Saying her name in that voice was a declaration of something that neither of them was quite ready to put into more specific language. She knew. She was saying so. He nodded once. He took his plate and his coffee to the small table nearest the counter. Not the window table which was occupied, but the one closest to where she was working, which she noticed, and which she was not going to examine in any public way. And he sat down, and he ate his pistachio pastry, and drank his coffee. And every few minutes, when she looked up from what she was doing, he was there. That was the whole of it. He was there. He was not performing being there, not making it mean something. It didn't mean not using his presence as currency, or leverage, or a declaration. He was just a man sitting at a table in a bakery, eating something that was genuinely good, and being present in the space of someone whose presence had become important to him. She restocked trays. She served 2 more customers. She made a phone call to her flour supplier about next week's order. She did her job. And the most dangerous man she had ever met sat at the table nearest the counter and read nothing and looked at his phone rarely and was simply completely unconditionally there. She thought about Luca, about the version of being together that Luca had offered, which was proximity with constant conditions presence that always had a cost-attached company that arrived with an invoice. She thought about 3 years of learning to be grateful for the moments when the version of him she could breathe around showed up and calibrating her entire emotional life around the unpredictable schedule of those moments. And then she thought about the man at the table nearest the counter. She thought about a corner booth on a Tuesday in October, a business card under a wine glass, a phone that rang twice, a question asked directly and answered directly. A Monday morning in a room above a restaurant where a conversation was had that she had not been present for, but that had closed a chapter of her life with a completeness she had stopped believing was possible. She thought about if he comes back on a white card. And she thought about the fact that Luca had come back, and Matteo had been there, and Luca had been handled, and the world had continued. And here she was on a Tuesday in March, with flour on her hands, and almond croissants sold out by 9:45. She thought I did not plan any of this, and I would not change any of it, and I am not afraid of what comes next. All 3 of those things simultaneously were completely true. At 2 o'clock, the last customer of the lunch rush left. The space went quiet. Sophia came around from behind the counter with 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from Matteo, because she was the owner and she could take a break when she needed one, and because sitting across from him felt at this point in the history of them like the most natural thing in the world. He looked at the cup she'd set in front of him, and then at her. "You don't have to." "I know," she said. "We've established that I know the difference." The corner of his mouth moved. It was a small movement. Matteo's face was not a face that moved in large gestures, but she had learned to read the small movements, the way you learn to read a language that was built for precision rather than volume. That particular small movement meant something she could name now after enough evenings, and enough corner tables, and enough conversations that had surprised both of them with how far they traveled. It meant he was happy, not performed happy, not happy for an audience. Just simply quietly in the way of a man who doesn't experience happiness frequently enough to take it for granted. Happy. She wrapped her hands around her cup. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," he said. Always yes, always the same way. Immediate without qualification. The yes of a man who has decided that her questions deserve his full attention and has no interest in reserving the right to deflect. "The night we had dinner," she said. "The first dinner the Saturday. When Luca sent the message to my phone. When I passed the phone across the table." She looked at him. "You looked at the message, and you put the phone down, and your face. I was watching your face very carefully. Your face did something that I've thought about since, and I've never asked you about it." He was still. "What did my face do?" "It got very quiet," she said. Not the normal quiet, a different kind. The kind that looked like something personal. The silence that followed was the longest of the particular variety that he used when he was deciding how truthful to be, and she had learned that those silences always resolved in the direction of the truth, that he simply needed the time to find the precise form of it. "I told you my grandmother came from Palermo," he said. "Yes, I told you she built a business, that she was formidable." He turned the coffee cup between his hands, a rare physical gesture, a tell she had catalogued. "I didn't tell you that she spent the first 15 years in this country in a marriage that was not what she deserved." He paused. "My grandfather was not a cruel man exactly. He was a man who had certain ideas about how a woman occupied space. certain ideas about what decisions belonged to him and what decisions belonged to her. And my grandmother, who was, as I've told you, the most capable person I've ever known, learned to conduct the important parts of her life in the margins, the bakery, her friendships, her language. She kept those things in spaces he didn't bother to look. Sofia was very still. I was 12 when I understood what I was watching, Matteo said. Old enough to see it, young enough that I didn't know what to do with what I saw. And my grandfather wasn't violent, wasn't dramatic. He was simply someone who had never once asked himself whether the life he'd given my grandmother was the life she would have chosen. He looked at the table. She died before I was old enough to do anything useful with what I understood. And I have, for 20-some years, had a very particular reaction to watching a man treat a capable woman as though her choices are his property. He looked up. That's what my face did when I read that message. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't about Luca. It was about my grandmother, and about 12 years old, and about the specific variety of rage that comes from recognizing something you've seen before, and being old enough this time to do something about it. Sofia sat with that for a long moment. You stood up for her, she said. Through me. I stood up for both of you, he said. There's no version of Tuesday night where I hear those words and stay in my chair. She looked at him. Really looked at him. The way she had been allowing herself to look at him more frequently over the past months. The full and unguarded version, without managing what her face was doing, or what the looking communicated. She looked at the man who had grown up speaking Italian at a dinner table every night for 15 years, who had sat in a corner booth and understood every word, who had stood up without deciding to stand up because the decision had been made 20 years ago, in a different room, at a different table. What was her name? Sofia said. Your grandmother. Concetta, he said. She repeated it quietly. Concetta. She picked up her coffee. I'm going to name something after her, she said. A pastry, the best one I make. Matteo looked at her. I'm serious, she said. You can't stop me, it's my bakery. He was quiet for a second. Then, she would have considered that either a great honor or completely excessive. Which would she have preferred? Both, he said. At the same time, she was complicated. And then fully, briefly, completely he smiled. The real one, the one she had seen only a handful of times that arrived without his permission and changed his entire face. She had been collecting those smiles the way her grandmother had collected certain things, not deliberately, not with a system, but with the specific care of someone who understands that beautiful things are rare, and the right response to them is attention. She had 4 so far. This was the 5th. 2 weeks later, a woman walked into the bakery on a Wednesday afternoon and asked for the almond croissant, and when Sofia told her they were sold out, she said, "They told me that would happen," with the specific tone of someone who has been warned and came anyway, and she ordered the pistachio instead, and then while Sofia was boxing it, she said, "You're Sofia Bennett." "I am," Sofia said. "I'm Elena Caruso," the woman said. She said it the way people say names they expect to be recognized. She was 60-something, well-dressed, with the carriage of someone who had inhabited authority for long enough that it had become indistinguishable from her posture. "I'm Matteo's aunt." Sofia set the box down on the counter. "He doesn't know I'm here," Elena said immediately. "He would consider this, his word would be excessive. My word would be necessary." She looked at Sofia with a directness that was completely, instantly recognizable. The family eyes. She thought the same quality of complete attention that assessed without performing assessment. "He told me about the bakery. He didn't mean to tell me. I asked what had been occupying his attention, and he started talking, and then stopped, which told me everything he was trying not to tell me." She paused. "He hasn't talked about a person the way he talked about you in a very long time." Sofia said nothing. She was listening. "I'm not here to give you a speech," Elena said. "I'm not here to assess you or warn you or do anything maternal and dramatic. I'm here because my nephew is a man who has given a very great deal of himself to things that have never given anything back, and he is constitutionally incapable of recognizing when something is good for him without an outside opinion." She picked up the pastry box. "I wanted to see the bakery. I wanted to see the person." She looked around the space. The north wall display cases, the handwritten menu, the small table where a woman was working on a laptop with a flat white, and then back at Sophia. "Conchetta would have liked you," she said. "That's all. She paid for the pistachio pastry." She left. Sophia stood behind the counter for a full minute without moving. Then she picked up her phone and called Matteo. He answered on the first ring again. "Sophia." "Your aunt was just here," she said. Dead silence. "Elena," she said in case there was ambiguity. "I know which aunt," he said. His voice had the specific quality it got when something had happened that he had not anticipated and was processing in real time. This happened rarely enough that she recognized it immediately. "What did she?" "She said Conchetta would have liked me," Sophia said. The silence that followed was the longest pause she had ever heard from him. Longer than the Saturday dinner silences. Longer than the Monday after the meeting silences. Long enough that she checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "I'm sorry," he said. "She shouldn't have, Matteo," Sophia said. "Yes, she's right," she said. "And so are you. And I think we both know that." She took a breath, not a nervous one, not the kind that precedes a performance, but the kind that precedes something true. "I think we've known it for a while. I think we've been walking around the edges of it being careful, because we're both the kind of people who've been hurt by moving too fast, and trusting too completely, and being careful made sense. It still makes sense." She paused. "But being careful doesn't have to mean not saying the thing that's true." Another pause, shorter. "What's the thing that's true?" he said. "That I trust you," she said. "Completely. Not because you handled Luca, not because you stood up in a restaurant, not because you know where the display cases should go. Because of who you are when no one's watching. Because of a grandmother named Conchetta and Italian at the dinner table, and the fact that you couldn't stay in your chair on a Tuesday night because of something you promised yourself at 12 years old." She looked at the north wall display cases. "That's who I trust. That specific person. And I don't think that's a small thing for either of us." The silence lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "No," he said. "It isn't." "Dinner tonight," she said. "The usual place," he said. She hung up and looked at her bakery, her cases and her menu, and her north wall, and the woman with the flat white, and the afternoon light coming in, and she felt the full weight of everything she had built, and everything she had survived, and everything she was standing in the middle of, and she thought about Luca saying "you still belong to me," in a language he believed was invisible. She thought about a Tuesday in October, and a corner booth, and a man setting a glass down on a table. She thought about the specific quality of being heard by someone who understood every word, and she understood, standing in the middle of the life she had built from scratch, the life that no one had given her, the life she had assembled in the margins of a relationship that had tried to make her small, and in the 11 months after she had finally walked away, she understood that the most extraordinary thing that had happened to her was not that Matteo Romano had stood up. It was not the meeting with Luca, or the business card, or the calls, or the walk through this empty space on a November Saturday. The most extraordinary thing was this: a man who had spent his entire life understanding that power came from making people afraid of you, had sat in a corner and heard a woman being threatened in his grandmother's language, and something in him that was older than strategy and deeper than calculation had simply refused to let it continue. He had not stood up because she was helpless. He had stood up because he was the kind of man, the rare and specific kind, the kind his grandmother had helped make him, who understood that the real measure of power was not how afraid people were of you. It was what you did with your power when staying in your chair was easier. He had stood up, and Sophia Bennett, who had spent 3 years being told she belonged to someone else, and 11 months proving that she belonged to herself, had looked across a restaurant at the man standing up and had understood. Before she knew his name, before she knew his history, before she knew anything except the quality of his attention and the fact that he had heard every word, that she was looking at something she had not seen before. Not a rescuer. Not a protector in the dramatic sense. Not a man who believed that standing up gave him a claim on anything. Just a person who had decided quietly and completely, and without requiring an audience, that this was not something he was going to look away from. The bakery filled with afternoon light. The woman with the flat white finished her work and packed her bag and said thank you on her way out and said I'll be back Thursday. And Sophia said, I'll save you a croissant, and the door closed and the space was quiet. Sophia looked at the case where the almond croissants had been empty by 9:45 on the first day, would be full again tomorrow morning, would be empty again by 10. She had built this. She had built all of it. She had carried the plan in her margins for 2 years, and she had survived what she needed to survive. And she had signed her name on a lease on a Thursday in December and opened on a Tuesday in March, and she had done every single part of it herself. And the man who sat at the table nearest the counter on a Tuesday afternoon, eating a pistachio pastry and being simply completely unconditionally. There he had not built this for her. He had not rescued her into it. He had not stood in front of it as though his presence made it real. He had walked beside her on a Saturday in November and asked about display cases and been right about the north wall and written nothing down and remembered everything, and that was the whole of it, and the whole of it was everything. The most dangerous man in Chicago had learned from a woman who baked almond croissants and kept her plans in her margins, that the most powerful thing a person could do was choose every day without drama, without an audience to stand beside someone instead of in front of them. And the woman who had once stood silent and shaking while a man spoke cruelty in a language he believed was invisible, had learned that her silence was never weakness. It was patience. Her kindness was never compliance. It was strength. And the life she was standing in the middle of the flour on her hands, and the empty trays, and the usual place at 7 o'clock, and a man who had stood up because of a promise made to himself at 12 years old, was not a life that had been given to her. It was the life she had always been building. It had simply finally caught up with who she was.